verses 14 through 17, I just titled that section, Woe unto the Skeptical Rulers of Jerusalem and a Messianic Prophecy. The Messianic Prophecy, of course, giving hope in the aspect of the punishment that's going to come because of those skeptical leaders. Now then, we get to verses 18 through verse 22. And in that section, I entitled it, A Syrian Invasion Demonstrates the Folly of the Egyptian Alliance. We mentioned several times how that the Israelites, the main nation at that time was the Assyrians. And to escape the oppression of the Assyrians, the Israelites would send an envoy down to Egypt to solicit their help. Well, this section demonstrates the folly of that. In verse 18, thus, he says, And your covenant with death shall be disannulled, and your agreement with hell shall not stand. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, then ye shall be trodden down by it. This is first addressed to Israel as a nation, and thus their covenant with death. That covenant with death being going down to Egypt for their help against the Assyrians. And Isaiah says this covenant with death shall be disannulled. It will be wiped out. Obliterated is another term that's used for this idea of disannulled. The terms that Israel was going down there to accept and to try to get help from, not going to be binding upon them. It's agreements that they were making to try to avoid or avert the danger that was coming against them. So Assyria was coming down with their armies. Basically, no one was able to stop them or overcome them. Every city that they came against, they destroyed. And so, what's Israel to do? Well, they send the envoy to Egypt. What's the envoy to Egypt doing? It's taking tribute to Egypt to buy their support. Now, we'll give you all these things. We'll give you all this money, all of this gold and silver and all of these things, if you'll come help us. So that's what they were doing. And it wasn't going to help. They made them that agreement thinking that Egypt would come help them at least. But Egypt wasn't. Egypt couldn't help them in any way. It's called an agreement with hell. The Hebrew word here is Sheol. Sheol has several different connotations. We generally say it's equivalent to the Greek word Hades, which is the realm of the unseen. That's where the areas which we refer to, paradise, Luke the 16th chapter, and Tartarus. Paradise where a person is blessed, Tartarus where he's punished. Sheol is equivalent to that, but it embraces more than that. It also embraces the grave at times. Just sometimes just the depths of the world. So it has, depending on the context, a lot of different connotations. And the way in which it's being used here, not specifically it, but the entirety of it, is that the people have no hiding place. There's no place of refuge for the people. While they're going down to Egypt, Egypt can't help. Assyria is still going to come. There's no place for them to hide, no place for them to get refuge. They thought Egypt was their refuge, when in reality God was. And by going to Egypt, they were forsaking God. The overflowing scourge, they mentions here, when the overflowing scourge shall pass through, they would be trodden down. The overflowing scourge is those Assyrian armies that are coming. And God is going to be using them to punish the Israelites. But the Assyrian army would pass through, and they would be trodden down by it. They would be destroyed by the Assyrian armies. Edward Young, in his commentary, points out that as for the overflowing scourge, when it does pass over, the nation will simply become a trampling for it. In verse 15, Isaiah had used the perfect, for there the idea of the flood passing over was simply one suggested as a possibility by the people. Here, however, the imperfect is employed, for the language here is that of prophecy, and the overflowing scourge is a certainty. Now, if you go back into verse 15, where he mentions this, because ye have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with hell we are at agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us. For we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. So much of what is stated there is stated here. The only difference is, there in verse 15, it is the idea more of a possibility of this taking place. Here, there's a certainty of it taking place. So it goes from possibility to a certainty in this verse. Do you want? No. Barry Hatcher wrote this about it, that there are three metaphors describing the overflowing of Judah. First, there is a flood which brings an inundation of punishment. Second, there is a scourge, an instrument used to inflict great pain by beating a subject with whips of various materials. And third, the invading forces tread or walk over them as one might step on ants. Judah thought somehow they would not be affected when invading armies marched through the land. But Isaiah informs them that they too will be trodden underfoot. And that's basically what you have in this. Three figures that Isaiah uses are metaphors, each one showing destruction of Israel. They're going to have a flood, overflow of punishment, scourge, great pain inflicted, and then tread over or trodden down, that they're going to be trodden underfoot of man or by the Assyrians. Not a pretty picture for Israel and what they have awaiting them. And all because they forsook God. So in verse 19, From the time that it goeth forth, it taketh you. From morning by morning shall it pass over, by day and by night, and it shall be a vexation only to the understand the report. So from the beginning of the punishment that God is going to send, terror and vexation would be continual. Morning, night, day and night, this terror, this vexation is going to be continual in that regard. It began under Hezekiah as Sennacherib came into the land and began to take the city after city. If you look at 2 Kings chapter 18 and verse 13, we're told that now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. So here's Sennacherib coming, all of the fenced cities, and Sennacherib takes them. And if you look back in chapter 8 and verse 8 of Isaiah, he mentions, and he shall pass through Judah. He shall overflow and go over. He shall reach even unto the neck, even unto the neck. And the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. So again, an overflowing of the land. He's going to go through it. They're going to be destroyed. But there's the beginning of it. Sennacherib coming, attained city after city. There's no escape. Well, there was one escape, but they wouldn't take it. And that is to look to God. And so there's a message or a report of obtaining one city after another as they progress down south toward Jerusalem. God is going to make them understand the report, the message of judgment and destruction. You're going to understand that this is a destruction that's coming. You can't avert it. You can't stop it. There's nothing you can do against it. Why? Because God's sending it. A rather hopeless situation in which Isaiah is presenting to them. There is a play on what is stated earlier in chapter 28 and verse 9, when he says, Whom shall he teach knowledge, and whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Them that are weaned from milk and drawn from the breast. Here's the difference. There's this play that they which mocked before are now going to understand better, and they're going to tremble. Have you ever seen someone who mocks at something, makes fun of it, ridicules it, and then they learn that, hey, this is the truth? Happens on a regular basis, doesn't it? That's kind of what's being a play on this idea of understanding and knowledge that Isaiah is presenting to us. Pulpit commentary noted this about these verses, that we know of at least 8 passages of flood through Judea. 1 under Sargon, 2 under Sennacherib, 3 or 4 under Esarhaddon, and 2 under Ashurbanipal. And there may have been more. So there were these waves of coming in and just passing through Judah of Assyria, different kings of Assyria, coming through the entire area and destroying them. In verse 20, we have a little proverb here. That for the bed is shorter than that of a man can stretch himself on it, and the covering narrower than he can wrap himself in it. A little proverb in the midst of this. A short, pointed statement about the nature of man and life. This is similar to our statement, our adage, you made your bed, now lie in it. That's kind of what he's saying in this. We've got probably other similar statements than that. That's one that I can remember. How many of you have used that? Probably all of us at one time or another. The Jews had made their bed of rebellion to God and to His Word. Now then, they were going to have to suffer the consequences of what they did. That's basically what this is saying. Now then, the figure is they've got a bed and a blanket that's too short for them. Have you ever tried to sleep on a bed that's too short? It's not very comfortable, is it? And then not to have a blanket that will even cover everything. It's going to make, also, it's too narrow. They don't have enough room. The blanket's not wide enough to even cover the body, and so if you cover one part, well, another part of your body is uncovered. You start getting cold. That's the figure. It's uncomfortable. It is a miserable way in which to try to sleep, if you can even sleep. And it could even be dangerous if it's too cold. If it's freezing and you don't have sufficient cover, what happens? It's frostbite and you can die. So it can be a dangerous situation. Yet that's the situation they'd placed themselves in. The covenant of lies, going back to verse 15 in that statement there, that made a covenant with death, hell, we are in agreement, and the overflowing scourge will pass through, it shall not come unto us, for we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. Well, those covenant of lies now will be too short and too narrow to protect them from the overflowing scourge that's passing through. Just cannot protect them. Homer Haley, and he makes this application of the verse. This isn't actually the meaning, but it's a good application. It's rather lengthy, but I think it's profitable for us to notice this. He says about 7.5 centuries later, the descendants of these mockers made a similar error. They made a covenant with death and an agreement with Sheol when they declared Caesar to be their king and demanded the death of Jesus, asking Pilate to set a guard by the tomb. But every effort failed. On the morning of the third day, the bars of death were broken asunder. The tomb was opened, and the body of Jesus was raised from the dead. 4 decades later, the Roman army swept across the land like an overflowing flood, destroying the city and the temple, slaying thousands and selling other thousands into slavery. The hail swept away their refuge of lies, for the bed was too short, and there were blankets, and there are blankets too narrow. Millions since have failed to learn the lesson, continuing to make covenants with death and agreements with Sheol, and hiding themselves under the lies of atheism, evolution, humanistic theories, religious errors, false faiths, a nominal Christian contentment. All efforts to hide from God and yet soothe the soul with a false sense of security or shams, walls of untempered mortar. When the overflowing scourge of divine judgment passes through, it shall be naught but it shall be naught but terror to understand the message. For the bed is shorter than that a man can stretch himself on it, and the covering narrower than what he can wrap himself in it. Our nation today has made that same type of covenant with so many things. He mentions atheism. How many seek and desire that atheistic lifestyle? Why? Well, one was honest enough to state why, when he stated essentially, the Bible is too repressive. We want our sexual freedom. We want to do things that the Bible would not allow. And so he became an atheist and advocated the atheistic position. How many are like that today? Reject God because, this that God demands is just too restrictive. I want to go out and enjoy myself. I want to have all of these other things that I can't do if I'm a Christian. Of course, they forget or they don't realize the blessings of being a Christian. They only see that restrictive nature. I can't do this and I can't do that. Can't go out drinking. I can't smoke. I can't go out and live immoral lives. I can't dance. I can't do, and I can just go on and on and on with what I can't do. Well, fill your life with what you can do, what the Bible teaches us to do. And when we do that, it will bring an entirely different light upon the situation. Evolution. Well, that again, that's what atheism rides in on, is evolution. That man is nothing but an animal. Well, if he's nothing but an animal, why not act like an animal? If man is nothing but an animal, then where's there any objective standard of right and wrong? Might as well do what I want to, hadn't I? Humanistic theories. Humanism is not humanitarianism. Humanitarianism is doing good unto others. Humanism is all about self. It is a philosophy that was set forth, I think the first Humanist Manifesto was written in 1943. And by the way, one of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto, number 1, was John Dewey. John Dewey had the most influence of any other man on our educational system. And you wonder why evolution is being taught? Because humanism and because of John Dewey's influence on the educational system. The second one was written, I believe, in 1973. And I think there's been a third one since then. But basically it says that man is the measure of everything. There is no God. And it goes through several different aspects. But tells us to look for a heaven or a hell is actually dangerous for us. It's bad for you to think of a heaven awaiting us, because and basically it just attacks Christianity. But it's all about man. Man's the standard of everything, the measure of everything. If you remember the debate that we watched when Thomas Warren debated Folly, Thomas Warren used what is known as the moral argument, that there is an objective moral standard that says something is right or wrong. And he appealed to the Nuremberg trials and the Nazis. And he continued to ask Folly, who never really answered it, did the Jews do wrong in murdering 6 million Jews? What did I say? I was thinking they killed the Jews. Did the Nazis do wrong in murdering 6 million Jews? He never would really answer it, because he knew that if he did, he was trapped. Because if he says, yes, they were wrong, by what standard? There was no standard of right and wrong. It wasn't against their law. In fact, it was their law that they should do that. If he said, no, they weren't wrong, well, look at what he's saying. So he basically refused to answer it with a yes or no. Well, that's because he was a humanist. But the only reason that the Nuremberg trials, that those individuals who were Nazis were convicted, was because they appealed, there was a standard higher than what they recognized. There is a standard that comes from God. And that standard by which you're judged guilty of crimes against humanity. Yeah.
You talk about all these people that say they can't do all these acts of sin, yet they can't see the destructive consequences.
Well, that's true. They can't see the destructive nature, that even if they do, they would rather enjoy those pleasures that they have. They don't think about tomorrow. It's right now. That's all they think about. But he also mentions the religious errors. How many in our society and in the Christendom, using that not for just simply the church, but Christian, have put their faith and their confidence in salvation by faith only? It is a covenant of lies. And yet millions today hold that. Okay, Carl.
It's like our granddaughter. She kind of dropped our grandbaby off. She leaves her car out at the road running. She did this 2 or 3 times, and I said something to her about it. And finally, I went out there and took the car off and talked to her neighbor's resident. And she came out and was like, freaked out. I said, you don't understand that you are responsible for if somebody takes that car and runs somebody over and kills them, it's your fault. It's just something that simple.
Well, we're not taught to think about consequences today. It's just the action of the minute. But also, and wanted to mention this one in particular, nominal Christian contentment. I'm content not really to be what a Christian's supposed to be and actively acting as a Christian and doing Christian works and deeds. But as long as I attend services, even though it might be only occasionally, as long as I attend services, I'm going to be all right. No, that's not true. We have the opportunity to come together to worship God and to study His Word. But our being here is not all that Christianity involves. If we don't take what we learn and go out and apply it and live the type of life and do the things that God wants us to do, then we're not going to make it. And yet, a lot of Christians think as long as I've been baptized, as long as I partake of the Lord's Supper, I've got it made. Don't have to do anything else. And so, while they don't believe, they say, in once saved, always saved, they act as if that's the way in which it is. Once dunked, always saved. And I said that purposefully because a lot of them aren't taught enough and don't know enough to even become Christians. They never repent of their sins. They have no real intention of doing anything as far as Christianity. And so they get dunked in water and they think everything's fine and I'm saved now and I don't have to do anything. No, the Christian life begins then. They think it ends there. But that's the beginning of going out and actively working and doing and being what a Christian's supposed to be. Doing good works to others. Teaching the gospel to others. And on, all of the things that God expects of us as Christians. And yet, many Christians have hung their covenant of lies upon the fact that I attend services. Big deal. Who cares? Well, you're supposed to. But what are you doing in your life? How are you acting in your life? I've seen know of some individuals who were supposedly Christians. They would attend services, and then when they left, they would swear like a sailor. Yode's statement there. They didn't know anything about Christianity, living the Christian life. And yet, if you had asked that person, are you saved? Well, of course I am. How dare you think that I'm not? No, they're on their way to hell because they don't live the type of life that God wants them to live. And they've made a covenant of lies within their life. Well, next week then, Lord willing, we'll start in verse 21.